any of your members of your unit wounded or killed?
No, not while we were there, except, I'll sneak this one in, it's full of these little incidents. This is at the new house, call it. I almost shot, his name was Jackson, his last name, and he was from Jackson, Michigan, I think. Not Mississippi, but Jackson, Michigan. And I said, look, one night I said to the guys, we take turns observing from the roof, the attic of that house, the way we did from the loft of the barn across the road in that older house. And we'd have our spotting scope up there in case something happened. We had to find out what's going on find out visually. And the part of the house that was at ground level, had been shot away. The entrance area, the door, the vestibule, and there was a stairway there that went up to the second floor, the attic. And we had a stairway, of course, going up from the basement to that first floor level. But getting from the head, the top of those basement stairs, around to the flight that went up to the rest of the house, you were in the open. But it was not for long, and you could do that very quickly. But then we slept down there in the cellar. We had a couple bunks set up, and we'd take turns sleeping and standing guard. And we had a stove down there, an old iron cooking stove, and we would heat our food that way and so on. Our light consisted of a wine bottle of gasoline and a rag stuffed in it. And we would burn that, and that's what gave us light and a lot of carbon in our lungs. The next morning we would be out there coughing up black oysters and spitting them into the snow. Well, anyhow, I said, why don't we do this? When you are coming down from your observation and your relief has to go up there, we don't know who's opening the door at the head of these stairs here, and we're sitting down there in that little basement room. How do we know it's you or a German group or some other? I said, so what I'm going to do is, while I'm waiting for my relief to come down and I hear somebody coming, I'm going right back in this coal bin, which adjoined our room, our basement room, and I'm taking a bead on whoever's coming down, and I'm shooting, because unless you guys whistle Dixie or something, we set on a song. If you whistle Dixie, then I'll know it's one of us. And this guy Jackson, who was sort of a nut to begin with, maybe he forgot, I think he just didn't care. He came down one night, and I didn't hear anything, and I was lined up at that doorway, that opening into the coal bin. And I had a bead right on where his head would be, and I took up the slack. And I had a round in the chamber with a carbine, and I took up the slack, and as soon as I would see that person, I would fire. And as soon as I saw it, fortunately, I knew Jackson so well that as soon as I saw the profile of the head, the leading profile, and we didn't have strong light, I let go. I'm not the shot, but let go of the trigger, because I would have killed him. I would have shot him right in the head. So,
not to get onto some.
Well, let me tell you one other thing about that locale. There, we have this room with this stove, and we would cook things there. We had sea rations. They came in cans, and some of it would be like a stew, and so Sergeant Sink, who I disliked intensely, and he deserved it. He really, nobody liked that guy. But he came to visit us. You know, it was a nice quiet day on the front and so on. And I don't know who did it. It wasn't done on purpose, but we would heat our food by just putting the can on the top of the stove. But I think perhaps someone just left the can there, didn't punch holes in the top, and forgot about it. And we were all going out to do something in the field, and he was there. And a can of food that he didn't realize was on the stove exploded right in front of him. It didn't really hurt him, you know, it didn't break a bone in his body or tear his flesh on his face, but it must have been a terrific shock. And then especially to feel the hot spaghetti or macaroni and cheese hit him at the same time. I don't know what he thought had happened, but we learned about this after we got back, and he had gone. He had, I guess, called for help or something.
You had mentioned about having a song or a code or something to help identify yourselves. In a lot of the World War II movies, they talk about the Germans infiltrating the American forces with
agents
who
the Battle of the Bulge.
Were you often quizzed about the World Series or anything?
Yes. After all, I knew quite a bit about baseball, but primarily about the Phillies and the A's because I was from Philadelphia. Well, you take somebody who was going to base all his knowledge on the St. Louis Cardinals or the Boston Red Sox, and I wouldn't have known, you know, who hit 3 homers in one game there and stuff like that. But we heard about that too, and it was used really at that period when the bulge first broke, as the December 16th, 17th, 18th, and they tried. But after all, some of those Germans had lived and studied in the U.S. And could speak English without an accent because they did that in younger years, earlier years, and learned it as kids. And so I don't know. I've read a lot of accounts about that it was effective. But boy, I would hate to have my life depend on that. If somebody, say, ask me a question like that, and I might say something to myself in Yiddish, like, oh boy, this is all the trouble I need. And then he hears me speaking something German that way.
Also, you were mentioning that you could actually see the Germans from your vantage point. In Private Ryan, that's a fairly small unit, but they had a sharpshooter within their group. Did you have sharpshooters?
Snipers.
Snipers? Yeah.
No, we had no snipers. We didn't have even the kind of rifle that a sniper might be using, unless you happen to pick up one of the German rifles, German weapons that suited that purpose. We were only armed with carbines. Maybe some of our guys carried M1s, but I don't recall that. And the non-commissioned officers of a certain rank, and of course all the officers, they carried Colt 45s, or there was another Browning 45. We did get a 50 caliber machine gun, not for each and every 2-ton truck. We had a number of 2-ton trucks, and some of them were equipped with those heavy machine guns mounted on a ring, so it could swing around any way, and that would be on the roof of the cab. But I think we had very few trucks equipped that way.
Did you ever get any sort of shooting?
Never. I never fired my my carbine during the whole time. I kept a little, and this was a GI issue item, just a little cloth, sort of a sack with a little tab, leather tab, and snap button on the open end of it. I kept that over the muzzle of my gun to keep it clean, to keep it clean. And I never had it off the gun. Oh, except I think I mentioned to you way back that when we were in the town of Heinsberg, and I'll move on to Heinsberg pretty soon. When we were at Heinsberg, we were told by some officer from some outfit that we'd have to get out on the street there. This is a little town that had a large church, and make sure they were calling for all of the local population to assemble in the church, because they were going to be addressed about the rules now that we were in this town occupying it, so that they wouldn't be shot. They would know that certain things were not permitted, and so on and so forth. So I was told to stop anybody who was leaving the church, any civilian who might be leaving the church. And I was outside, and remember, everything has got snow all over it too. It's that time of the year for Heinsberg. And a young girl comes out. She wasn't actually in the church, but she was as though she were starting to go in it and changed her mind. And so she comes out away from the church and starts walking down the street.
How old?
By young, I mean she could have been anywhere from 14 to 17, let's say. And I don't recall for sure, but that I said anything more than told her, halt, laufen nicht, don't run, and maybe she didn't know my Yiddish accent, but she kept running, or sort of jogging, walking in a fast hustle. And I automatically took off my muzzle protector and was starting to take aim at her. And when it occurred to me, what am I doing? This is a young girl. All right, if she's running to tell somebody what the Americans are doing, they were all doing that all the time anyhow in that village. Certainly they were supplying information through other Germans who had contact with the German military. And this sort of thing goes through my mind right away. I can't shoot this girl in the back dead, because if I shoot her, I'm going to shoot her so she won't run away. And a lieutenant, not from our outfit, from some other outfit, came along at that time in a Jeep. And he said, "What's up?" And I said, "That girl took off when she was supposed to go in the church." And he said, "Okay, let's get her." By this time, she had made some distance from us. And I jumped in with him, and he, did some turns on as the road did. And he said, "Do you see her? Do you see her? Is that her up there?" And I said, "Oh, there she is. She's going. She's, maybe 50 or 100 yards ahead of us." And what she had done was ran into a farmhouse. And we went there, he and I, and banged on the door. And the people there kept saying things to us in German that we couldn't understand. And I wasn't sure what the situation was. Were they saying she never went in there, or that she's so-and-so and wouldn't hurt a flea and is not a spy for the Germans, God knows. And it didn't take long before the lieutenant said, let's get out of here. This is ridiculous. And it was. So, but if I had followed that literally and shot that girl, well, I think I would have gotten over it, because after all, that's what I was there for, follow orders. But so to answer that initial question, other people in our outfit, I think, had encounters, and I think I also told you once a story about a man assigned to our outfit who was not really of our outfit. He was connected with the Coast and Geodetic Survey, I guess it was, that federal agency. And his reason for being with our outfit was that he was supposed to be an expert in calculating and conducting surveys, topographic surveys, which was a big part, a very important part of our work. And he had the rank of major, and he came back one evening to where we were based and said that he had gone into a house and there was a German soldier up in the attic, and he called for him to come down, and the guy came down with his gun out. And so this major, who had what we called a grease gun, is similar to but became famous like the Israeli Uzi, and he just ripped the guy in half with his little machine gun as the guy was coming down the steps facing him. But I don't know if the German had a weapon in hand or what. Knowing the way I saw this other guy, he probably just shot him so he could say that he killed a German. So there may have been other cases in our outfit being a Battery B, some maybe 200 people.
Did you ever have any German armored units go by?
Yeah, while we were in that house in the Siegfried Line that I described, the one among the Dragon's Teeth, the one with the reinforced concrete floor, got a telephone message from one of our lieutenants. I was on observation duty that night. It was a terrible night, cold, and he said there were 60-mile-an-hour winds, and this was in late December or early January, early January, and he said there are 5, I don't know if it was Tiger or Panther, but I think Tiger tanks coming your way. And those were the heaviest German tanks, and they were really way ahead of our tanks, and I mean way ahead in the strength and the armament and all that. And he said, I said, well, I can't see or hear anything. He said, yeah, because they're over that ridge on your left. And so he said, when they get over your way, drop a grenade, and we didn't even have any grenades. Drop a grenade in the radio and take off. I said, take off? Which way? He said, which way? That's up to you. I said, aren't you guys don't you have somebody somewhere near us? Are you sending a truck out for us? And no, he said, just get out of there as best you can. And fortunately, they never came over the ridge. So
you couldn't hear them that time, but could you hear them at other times, the movement?
I'm not sure. Now, I've never thought about that, but there were lots of other times, lots of other places, but I don't think so. I don't think so. There were one or two instances where that might have happened, but I'll tell you this. In my war experience, the only kind of fire that I can think of that I hadn't experienced, that hadn't been directed toward me, was aerial bombardment. We had aerial strafing. That was when we were on the banks of the Rhine, near a city called Rheinberg or Rheinsburg, and we were there for a long time. And the house that we lived in was, to my mind, sort of a mansion farmhouse. It had suffered, it had been beaten up a lot, but it was quite spacious and comfortable. And I remember being outside, and when all of a sudden these planes come over, and the best I could do was to dive into the entryway of one of the entryways into the house. And that gave me, put my body in a position vis-a-vis cover that shielded me from the plane. I was half out, sticking half outside, and just the upper part of my body, the shoulders and the head, and so on, arms, flung inside the doorway. And there were a few planes, and they made at least one full run, maybe a couple runs. It didn't take long, and they were over, and they shot, and I wasn't hit. And there weren't many other people around me, and nobody was hit. It may have been a few, very few of us there at that time.
I don't know what you want to cover next. Do you want to jump ahead to the Rhine when you were at the Rhine?
Well, yeah, I think I'd better. You see, we had 3 campaigns. On my, the medals I have, the ribbons that I would wear eventually, the ribbon that represented the European theater, there was a European theater, Pacific theater, and American theater. European was primarily brown and green, and that has 3 bronze stars, little bronze stars on it. Each one refers to a campaign. So we were in the Ardennes, or the Battle of the Bulge, in the Rhineland campaign, and that was a big industrial, for us, where we were, north, and a big industrial area. The Ruhr River is nearby, and a lot of the big manufacturing plants there. And then the third one was Central Europe. And Central Europe would be on the other side of the Rhine and going toward, and we could have been in Berlin. Of course, the Germans would have welcomed us with open arms, but it was decided that the Russians would take Berlin, and we stopped at the west bank of the Elbe River at the nearest city of any size, Stendal, Stendal, and that was somewhat northeast of a large city called Magdeburg. So you want to go to the Rhine from there and skip the Ruhr?
Whatever.
Well, I don't know what the time situation is. So.
Let me check. We've got about 12 minutes left on this tape.
Do you have more tape you want to use?
Tape.
Okay. I do want to tell you something about the Ruhr. There were all these industrial areas. This was also coincident with the warming of the weather. Not really warming, I mean, relief. from that was a very bad winter. It was the coldest winter in 50 years, I think, in Europe. And we spent a lot of time moving around, going from one town to another.
Was it hard to stay warm?
Oh, yeah, but we managed. It was hard to stay warm. We couldn't... we had what they called combat boots. They were just the typical heavy leather shoes with an attached flap arrangement of leather that went around the ankles, and that laced up all the way for that. See, and we no longer wore leggings. When I went in the Army, we were issued canvas leggings that were just canvas wraparounds, covered the lower part of the leg, and you had the very, very long, heavy shoestring that would be looped in and out, and back and forth, to put those leggings in place. And they had a band that would go under the sole near the heel. But then we had our just regular Army field shoes, as I say, and when we were in training in the States, eventually we got these combat boots, and that's what we were supposed to be wearing during the war. But it was very, very bad on the feet. A lot of people got losing toes and that kind of frostbite of the feet. Because of not only the cold, but you're in the wet snow, you're in the muddy slosh, and we got galoshes, just like civilian galoshes, the old style, the rubberized fabric. You pull it up, and it's got maybe 3 clamps to secure them around your ankles and slightly above. Now, we had one guy in the outfit, his name was Bob Bash, a very good name for him because, well, he was a big, big, strong guy. He came from upper New York State. And he was so strong that we were issued machetes. I think we were one of the few military units that went around with at least for a while, with these long machetes in canvas, olive drab canvas sheaths on our side. They were very much necessary for us in the States. When we were in the South training, we had to slash a lot of growth in order to conduct our topographic surveys through. But in Europe, we hardly ever used them. But Bob Bash could take that machete, and with one whack, he could chop through a sapling of several inches diameter with just one slash, no whacking away and cutting notches, none of that. So here we were in Europe, and I remember one night we spent in the local railroad station, just a small place, and there was equipment around, railroad equipment. And Bob Bash is lying on the floor. We're lying on the floor trying to get to sleep. And he's lying on the floor, and he's got a pair of wheels from a train or a cart of some kind that ran on the rails. And it's got a bar, axle bar across it, and he's using it for weight exercise. I couldn't pick the thing up, let alone lift it up there, lying down and raising it over his head and forward and back and so on. Okay, this was around Holland. We were near the Dutch border, and we had to go somewhere at night, convoy of our trucks. No lights, nothing. The enemy is around. So we're going along, and we come to a place, and I know that our leaders are lost. They don't know where the hell we are or what turn to take. There are no real roads, they're just paths, and it's pitch black. And we come to this stop, and then all of a sudden we hear troops marching toward us. Somebody's keeping the cadence, and calling things out to the troops. We don't know. Is it us? Is it not? We were together with Canadians and British in that northern area. We came under the command of Marshal Montgomery, and that's a whole nother story. And this comes closer and closer. And remember, we don't have any firepower, our group, so we're not going to start popping off at anybody. And they get closer, we hear some British accent. And here's this officer, and he's counting cadence and cheering them up, keep it going, fellows, and then he becomes aware of us, and he says, "Hello, America." And we all said something around "Hooray, Britain" or something, and they march right through. And when you see these, of course, we had seen a number of the British troops. I think I told you somewhere on the tape about, or maybe off the tape, about Willie Williams, and when he got injured and we had to get help from some British troops who were there. They're wearing the uniforms that have white canvas straps crisscrossing in front of them, to hold their equipment, and belts and all, and they're stark white, and they stand out like crazy against the dark uniforms, and they had to do that. That was the way they were uniformed, and they would use a thick white, what used to be in my civilian use at that time, when you had white shoes, you put on this very heavy liquid white shining instead of wax, and that's what they do. And they had an expression for it. I forget what it was. Blanco, the Blanco's got to be right, and the Blanco's got to be clean and fresh, and so they were inspected for their Blanco too. And there they are marching by. And it's like a comedy scene in a movie. And then as they go by, he turns around and he says, "Goodbye, America," and we all cheer. But this was a story about Bob Bash, really, because we get our vehicles get started up again, and we start going, and we hear somebody yelling, "Wait, don't leave me, wait," and the voice is crying, and it was Bob Bash, and they were just turning the truck around, and he thought they had left him on purpose, and he was running, and here he couldn't see where he was running in the dark, and he was crying, and really and poor guy had no galoshes, because he was so big and so strong that they didn't send galoshes big enough for him, and so he was very depressed at that time. Bob Bash, yeah. So, okay.
Let me check the tape. Okay, it's back on.
Not long after that period I just described with Bickerath and Cimmerath, incidentally, just before we left that area, I guess it was because the American troops had taken it. We were told there's going to be a raid on those Germans, and our guys will come through at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. or 4 a.m., whatever it was, and the Americans took it like that. I guess they chased those guys out or killed them all or took them all prisoner. I could see our American troops coming by, and I could hear a little firing going on at that short distance. And then I saw some Americans coming back, and it was all secure. So that was that. But I want to say about, in that general area, we were moving back and forth here and there, and some interesting things came up. We were in a town called Heinsberg, and that was in Germany. And it was there I saw my first German fatal casualty. He looked at me like he must have been some kind of an officer, and his body was I don't know how long it had been lying there because our combat troops had come through earlier, and he was lying out there, and some of us were looking at it. It was right outside a post office. And he was obviously wounded in the gut, and somebody said something about, hey, I bet he's got some valuable stuff on him, if we ought to check him out, meaning maybe sidearms or something. And I said, I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. And some wise guy in our bunch said, well, here's a 12-foot pole. It was some kind of a long pole lying around. So I just took the pole and gave the guy a little nudge, and I said, here, okay, I touched him. I went in the post office, and I could see still on the wall signs saying, Juden sind hier unerwünscht. Jews are unwanted here, and other things like that. And I even picked one or two up and carried it as a souvenir. I may still have it somewhere. So I knew for sure I'm in Germany, but there was a lot of action moving around in that Ruhr area. The temperatures began to warm up for some reason, and we got stuck in an awful lot of mud. We had a lot of mud problems moving our vehicles.
About what date was this?
This would have been toward the latter part of January.
So the Bulge was ending or over by that point, the Battle of the Bulge?
Oh, no. The Battle of the Bulge, yeah, that was over by the 26th or the 22nd. Well, here's...
Let me check the date.
Okay.
We got 1 minute.
Well, I don't...
Switch?
Well, you can switch, you can change because... But I just had the thing in mind I wanted to mention. Yeah, it was about Heinsberg, but may as well put that at the beginning of the next one, give us some continuity too.
All right.
I guess Heinsberg was our first really sizable town, and I mentioned about the people, the German people in the town being directed to get together in the big church so that they could be told what to do, what they could do and not do, and so on and so forth. And I described seeing my first dead German on the field, and he was at the post office, and what the Nazi sign I saw there. Other things occurred that I think are of interest. There was a mail service, we would get our mail service, but it would be kind of sporadic. It had to catch up with you. I didn't get letters from home, which I didn't get many, and that was all right with me. I wanted to keep home off my mind as much as possible, and but I did write to some guys I knew from civilian life, and one of them is a fellow named Sam Rowland. He lived in Strawberry Mansion, the same area of Philadelphia that Kay was from, but I knew him not as a neighbor or anything of that sort, but as a co-worker when I was working as a civilian for the War Department in the Signal Corps Depot. Sam Rowland also worked there, and he was drafted and went to Fort Hood in Texas, and I think he was with an armored outfit. At least that's what I identify Fort Hood with, U.S. armored divisions. And so we would correspond, and while I was at Heinsberg, I got some mail delivery, and I noticed that this was a little sort of a government mailer, the sheet you folded up, a V-mail, I think they call it, and It was that sort of thing. And when I got it, it had some sort of a stamp, rubber stamp on it, and it said something about not deliverable, and I didn't understand it. You see, I thought that Sam Rowland had written to me when I saw this, but it turned out to be my last letter to him. And then it dawned on me that Sam Rowland had been killed. And it did say some words that meant that on the front of it. That's why it was not deliverable. And so it was returned to me. Well, that really hit me pretty hard, because while I knew guys who had been wounded or killed or died, one of my fairly close high school classmates died in basic training in the South. One of the southern states, he died from heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and so on. And that's the way we were drilled and trained, and all was bound to happen. But that really bothered me. We slept in rooms in what was let's call it a brewery inn. There was it was a building, a fairly small, modest building, but it had a stable yard in the back, and they brewed the beer there that they sold at their restaurant. And they had rooms for overnight guests and parlors, I guess, for entertainment and so on. And that's where we made our beds. Now, when I say we sleep in the room didn't look like that kind of a room at all. We'd have a dozen guys in a small room sleeping, one on top of the other, cots, no cots, in and out of closets and all that. We also had need of a latrine, though, in that location. So in the courtyard, in the back, it's not a forecourt, but the sort of utilitarian space, stables and so on. They had some farming. That ownership had a little bit of farming right there on the edge of town. But I was approached by one of our intelligent officers saying to me, "Look, Roth, you're an architecture student, aren't you? Yeah, so how about building us a latrine facility here?" So I had to dig the hole. Well, it was very necessary. The facility was necessary, at least the straddle trench, because we had all developed dysentery, very bad, to a very bad degree. It laid me low for a couple days, and it laid most everybody else low, and that harmed our efficiency, you know. But he said he wanted me to build something that was much more comfortable than squatting over a straddle trench, and so I said, I've got it, and I made the trench, and then I took one of the chairs from the inn, and they had the woven seats, like rush or some other natural material like that. And all I did was I took one of the chairs and I knocked that part of the seat out, and I said, "Here it is." Of course, with dysentery, I hope it happened that way, but I would imagine the lieutenant might have splashed the backs of his lower legs too while he was suffering dysentery, if he was. Really, it was so bad, and we couldn't figure it out until next spring, that coming spring, when I observed that the way they fertilized their fields there, they'd have a metal tank, laid horizontally on a little carriage formed of wheels, and then the I don't know what they call them, struts or something like that, that the horse or even a steer could fit in there and pull this thing along, and they'd knock open the big valve, and the liquid that drained off the manure piles, which had been then transferred to the tank, would then spray out from the back of it, and that would fertilize the fields. But during the winter, when we occupied Heinsberg, when we first went into Heinsberg, there was such a tank, and our really stupid and very, very unsanitary mess sergeant took a tank like that to get our drinking water. He would take it to the watering point where they had the Army had big tank trucks, and would fill that thing. We learned to call it the honey bucket, but we didn't have nobody realized at the time that it was really used for the purpose of spreading the fertilizer, which was liquid obtained from the cow dung pile out in the courtyard. So.
Well, let's jump ahead to the Rhine.
Right. At the Rhine, we came to a definite stopping point, and our outfit was quartered and was, I would have called a farm mansion. And we kind of enjoyed being there, because we had no place else to go. Of course, we had observation crews out all the time. Some were occupying occupation posts at the extreme front, and some were surveying, doing topographic surveys, which is the sort of thing I was mostly involved with. And that's a place where we suffered aerial strafing, but fortunately didn't do any real damage to us, equipment or personnel-wise. But we had some other events. In the room in which I slept, we had about 12 of us sleeping. And there was almost no room to get out without treading on somebody if you had to get out. We were happy to be in that room. While it did face the river and it had big windows, the big windows had big heavy draperies on them. And we piled even more on them, as many as we could, so that we could have a blackout and not show any light to the enemy when we were using the room and not using it. But obviously we slept there every night. The heat we got was from a very, very common means that the Germans have been using for centuries, and especially in rural locations. There's a stove. Some of them were elaborate tile work, others were very simple, and they would burn little bricks of coal dust. They're formed into a sort of an egg shape or a little cube shape, rectangular, and they would burn in the stove, and then they would pulverize. As they burned, they turned into almost a powder that would fall through the grates below and accumulate at the bottom. And every so often you have to shovel that stuff out and discard it. But the draperies in that room were so heavy and long that they piled up at the bottom. And nobody paid any attention to the fact that sometimes the red-hot glowing dust that fell out of there would spread. And one night, I was shaken very strongly in the middle of the night, and my first reaction was sit up. I sat up straight on I had a cot, a canvas cot, and I sat up, and as soon as I sat up, I breathed in, and as soon as I breathed in, I was gagging on smoke, and I could finally make out that somebody was yelling at me, fire, fire. And guys were fighting their way out the door. Fortunately, we had an open gallery along that side of the building. It was just like you see in some motels, a walkway with a rail fence, and we were a second floor, and so it was easy to get over that rail fence and hold on and then drop the rest of the way down into this little service court. But it took me some time to get out of that room because of the coughing and coughing and coughing. But I made it, and so did everybody else. So that was something there. The last thing I want to mention about Rheinsberg is that somehow one evening I was on my own, and as I say, we were there a long time, and I walked on down the road toward a very, very large church, and nobody was around, and I walked into not the sanctuary so much as where they had offices and libraries and that sort of thing, and went into a room where there was a large table and a number of boxes that contained photos. And I looked at the photos on the table and the photos in the boxes, and there were many, many pictures of Jews, just like mug shots, but much more artistically done and without numbers. I don't think they had numbers on them, but there were profile shots and full-face shots, and many of them were Jews with beards and yarmulkes, and I don't know what kind of study they were used for there, but it was obviously Jewish related, and it was racial, ethnic, that sort of thing. So that was that. Before we left that farm property, I had one of the most amazing nighttime experiences, and that was the shelling of the other side of the Rhine by U.S. artillery. I won't go into great detail, but just to say that it was, to me, well, there's a painting about the Philadelphia family of artists, the sons and the father, and well, the father gave the sons these names like Raphael and Rembrandt, and I just can't think of the last name right now, but they're very famous, and one of them did a painting where someone is pulling back a curtain to show an art gallery filled with paintings on it, and so but to me, this night was like Dante pulling back a curtain to give you a peek into hell, but as deeply into hell as you could go. I never saw any artillery or fireworks or natural blaze that could compare to that. And it lasted for hours, and it was just fantastic. Like somebody had pulled...
Well, describe it.
Well, I just told you as best I could.
But was it a line of fire in sequence, or? Oh,
it was all kinds of explosions, and it was just a blaze over there. And this was some distance away. The opposite shore from where we were might have been a mile away, and might have been even a little more, because that's a sizable river, the Rhine. And it was just, everything was red, yellow, white, and going this way and that way, and the sounds of all this artillery firing over
Were you watching the flashes of the artillery or the explosions on the other shore?
No, the explosions. Oh, the artillery was all around us. You couldn't see where the artillery was. They were miles back.
Oh.
And there's probably some aerial stuff. Who knows? It was just like it was without any limit, without any bounds. And it went on for a long, long time. I was standing guard that night. So I saw a lot of our guys looking around to try to see that. And as I walked beyond my bounds, a little this way and that way, and the next day somebody started to give me hell about that. Where were you when you were supposed to be on guard duty? I was on guard duty. I said, where were you, hiding? You know, and so we crossed the Rhine from a little ways north of that point, and when we got over there on the other side, that was an experience in itself, but it was neat and orderly, well organized. It just took time. It just was like a tie-up at a commuter's bridge nowadays. But we went over the pontoon bridge that had been set up across this big, big river, the Rhine, and then we saw for miles gliders, wrecked gliders, because our airborne troops had been brought in, American and British, and many of them were crashed, the gliders. But we were told that all the information we had been gathering during the week or weeks that we stayed at that place on the American side of the Rhine really paid off, because they had all the locations of German guns and installations, and that's what they were bombing. They weren't just setting the place on fire. They were doing a lot of detailed wreckage.
Now, I don't know if this is jumping too far ahead, but toward the end of the war, I remember you telling me about Germans who were making arrangements to surrender.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
if you want
Well, this was a big jump ahead. We did have some time in the Rhineland, you know, and some experiences, but not for long. In the springtime, of course, the war ended, technically, I say, on May 7th, officially on May 8th. The war ended there. But between the time I'm talking about now, crossing the Rhine, I forget the exact date, and spending a little while on the far side, on the east side of the Rhine. Incidentally, that's where I got my Nazi flag. There was a town called Dinslaken, I believe, and I went into the fire station, their firehouse, and got their flag. It was not flying, obviously. It was in the upper reaches of the building, and I got that, and that's the one I sent home, and we still have. But we were told we were going to make a big move, and sure enough, we were piled into our trucks, and we started moving eastward, excuse me. And it was tough, because we were jammed in to the trucks, and we just were on the road all the time. However, Germany had the Autostraden, the automobile superhighways, and that served our purpose beautifully. And they hadn't been wrecked or bombed to any extent. And we went along there making terrific mileage. We had aerial cover. We did see some, over the course of time, I saw some German planes, whether they were Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitts. I was never very sure, but I think various models. But when we went across Germany that way, in one big leap, we had to stop some night and sleep, I think, 1 or 2 nights. then here came the, I don't know if that was called the P-38 or not. It was the twin fuselage plane. It had one name for the original model, and then there was an all-black model. I think it was called the Black Widow or something like that. And that it gave me such a great thrill to see these fantastic, super modern planes coming over our trucks and providing protection. And we went really as far as you could go. We went to the Elbe River. We were set up in a little village, little farming village. It was near the town of Stendal, or I guess they called it Stendal. And I don't know how many miles that was from Berlin, but it wouldn't have been more than 20, 30, 40 miles in that range. And we really had nothing to do there but just hold our place. The Americans and the Russians had met farther south along the Rhine, and I think that was at the Remagen Bridge. And I don't know that that was terribly far away from where we were, but it was Berlin was closer to us, I think, than we were to Remagen. And
about what time was this?
The time of the year.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it was March or April, but it was much milder, and we were away from the great forests and no more snow, anything like that. But we were cut off. We had made such a leap that we were cut off by Germans behind us. We could not get food supplies. So we ate everything we had. We ate those people who were still hanging around their places there, their little farms. We ate their chickens, and we got down to just flour that our cook could use to make some kind of bread and that sort of thing. So we did have mobility, and our guys were out looking for food sources, and they fell upon some German military camp and hospitals that had been vacated. And I remember they came back with just two items I can remember from there. One was boxes of marmalade. And that's the way the marmalade sort of all gelled, not so much like preserves, but like a very cloudy jelly, pretty solid. And this was sort of a plum flavor. And so we'd eat that on the bread that our mess sergeant was still able to make. And then they ran into a lot of canned stuff. It was raspberries. Well, that sounds deluxe and all, but they were just, they weren't commercial. They were made for their military or their hospitals. They said they had gotten a lot of this stuff from the hospitals. And I still have some little trays, metal trays that they had that had different hospital equipment and materials in there. I kept one box and made a nice little compact whatnot cabinet. And we opened the raspberry cans, and they had worms in them. At least that's the way we interpret it, like little, I don't know if they call them pinworms or what. They're very short, and they're white. And I thought to myself, well, I can imagine, excuse me, that they are maybe little seed shoots. After all, these raspberries are seeds. And maybe these are little shoots that came from those things. But they were only at the top. They weren't mixed in with the bottom stuff. And I ate them. And I don't know if some of the guys wouldn't eat them or couldn't eat them. I mean, the raspberries, period. But I ate the raspberries with the white things and thinking to myself, this may be my only source of protein. So I did that. While we were there in that village, we had heard that not only had the Germans cut us off, but they had a mass killing there at a place called Gardelegen, Gardelegen. And what it was, they got something like 1,300, I think, maybe more, people into a big barn. It was a masonry, brick barn, essentially. And they set it on fire.
These are Jews?
Huh?
Jews?
I don't know if they were just Jews or not. I believe I have in my boxes of records an article from Life magazine, which covered this eventually, soon after it. And so it was described to me, and I figured, excuse me, that they must have been Jews, but it could have been a mix of different kinds of prisoners and some of these forced labor types. And so I got a chance to go there. See, I didn't have access to a Jeep, but somebody was going there, and I went with them. And I went in the place, and it had been used as sort of an airfield during the war by the Germans. It was quite open, and while it was a slight rolling grade to the place, it still could have been used for light aircraft or military aircraft of some kind. And I went in there, and I could see blood caked on the walls, and burned in to the walls, and it was very windy there because it was on a knoll, on a rise, and completely open, and a big body of water nearby, the Elbe River, all those factors. So the air was blowing through that place continuously, and still you could smell the smell of burnt flesh. And this would have been, at least a week after that, maybe 2 weeks after it happened, maybe even 20 days. But I saw there was a graveyard, and I had heard that the U.S. military commander had forced the people of the city to not only come and see this thing, but then to help work in clearing the bodies out and burying them. And then they had to come there and see everybody from the town that they could round up to show it to them. And so I was overwhelmed. I was stunned by it. And I had seen other dead people. I haven't covered it in this talk, but I'd seen other people who were similar types, refugees, I would call them, just lying out, piled up, a few of them, in the open on the back of a cart for days and days before they were taken away. And, but I saw all these white crosses. They were painted. They're all painted. They were all crosses. They set them up, and they only had numbers on them. I don't think they were able to identify people very well. And so I thought, well, this is so immense. It's so overwhelming. What can I do? How can I handle this mentally? Because it seems unreal. They might have just stuck crosses in there and said, "See what you Germans did, see?" So, and also there seems to be no respect for the people who were killed. There should have been maybe there was something put up explaining why. So I decided, well, before I leave, I'm going to go around, I'm going to touch each one to say goodbye and so on. I don't think I got more than a couple dozen before I couldn't continue anymore. There was just on the basis of time, I wouldn't be able to do that. So that was one strong experience. We had other experiences too at that location. You mentioned about the German troops surrendering. Well, I noticed when we were on our way into that area in our own trucks, we were going through towns on some roads. It wasn't all I said autostraden before. That was the Italian term, I think. Autobahnen is the German. And we'd be coming through in our open trucks, and we'd see all the townspeople out there on the sidewalks. Are they watching us? No, what they were watching was the German prisoners being brought through, and whenever there was a slowdown or a stop, they were running up and throwing bread and whatever they had to the German prisoners, you see. So, well, all right, it's but the numbers, great numbers. This is happening in great numbers. So while we're at this location that we finally reached, Eddie Bierman, one of my closer friends, he and I are going down a road. And we look, I imagine, like some of those cartoon characters. What was it, Bill and Joe or so on? What was his name? Auden? Not Auden. There was a cartoonist who was very famous.
Right, for the GI.
Huh?
Who did the cartoons of the GIs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I figured we looked like these two guys, except maybe younger and thinner versions. And we're going down a road, and lo and behold, all of a sudden, we see the whole German army marching toward us. And I mean an army. It was something like a parade. These guys, they may have been 6 abreast, even 4 abreast. It was very impressionable, especially when they're carrying their weapons. They're carrying their similar to the AK-47 nowadays. They had this machine gun kind of weapon that we didn't have. And in front, a number of high-ranking officers. I could tell they were colonels. Stopped and halted the troops, and they asked us in German, "Wohin ist den Gefangenenlager? Where is the prisoner camp?" Gefangenenlager. I said, "You hear that, Ed? Gefangenenlager. The Gefangenenlager." It's Ed knew Yiddish, and so did I. So we knew enough of this guy's German. I said, "We can't tell him that we don't know, because it's not good any way you look at that." So I said, "Yeah. Es gibt vielleicht." See, a Jew would say "Efscher," but in German, "vielleicht," perhaps. For the word perhaps, Efscher. Es gibt vielleicht 5 Kilometer through there, auf and links, on the left side. And he salutes us, and we salute him, and he gives the commands, and off they go.
How many altogether?
I would say to me, it looked like it could have been a regiment. And a regiment could have been a couple thousand guys. And that's the way it was.
But this was still during the war.
Well, yeah, but you see, they knew it was like hands off. But talking about this point, still during the war, before we ever got to a point where we got in our trucks and went across like that, I mean, we were still going bit by bit. There came a rumor in our outfit that some guys are going to be pulled out and taking some of our trucks are going to be sent way out to the front that was building up way out in the east, and where the Germans have finally, they can't go beyond that, you know. They would be at the Elbe River. So when I heard that Willie Williams was going, I was so used to working together with him and relying on him because he was a sergeant and he had more knowledge of how things happened in our outfit and so on and so forth. And for whatever reason, no, it was going to be Willie Williams, and it was going to be Rabbit Greenup. We called him Rabbit. He was a small guy, a very young guy, well, like myself, but only even a little younger. And there was going to be a new lieutenant who had come into our outfit. He had an American. He had a Polish name, Pikula was his last name. And there was a guy, another guy, I think. Anyhow, and there were some others that I didn't know too well. Some of our hillbillies, they were driving the trucks. And so off they went. And then sometime later, a couple weeks at least, we heard, oh, they came back. The drivers came back with the trucks, some of the trucks. And one of them said to me, he said, you know your buddy Williams, he's not going to come back. And I said, how come? They said he was killed. He said 3 of the guys were shot. It may have been 4, but it's in that little booklet. And I was really very sorry about that. You know, these guys, they went, well, not really volunteers, but almost as volunteers. And they were shot at a time when the war was really over, and so on and so forth. Well, fortunately for Willie Williams, as it turned out, he was not killed. And eventually he gave me the story once he got back. He was in a truck. Greenup and Pikula were up front in the cabin. He was in the back, the open body of the truck, the 2-ton truck, I believe it was. And they were going through some forested or woods area, and they were shot upon by the Germans. So the 2 up front were killed. And Willie, he was in the back of the truck. They may not even have seen him, but he was going to try to get out. But he had to crawl over the pile of spare tires in there. As he crawled over that, they shot at him, and he got hit in the buttocks. And I think he got hit somewhere else too. You know, he had sort of a crippled arm in the service. He came in. He was a top-notch lacrosse player for University of Maryland before he came in the service. And one of his arms was sort of bent this way, and he didn't have full movement of it, and yet he was an athlete and all that. So he got shot in the behind, and they told him to get out of the truck, and he got out of the truck. And he said they stripped him of his stuff. They'd always take your watch, take your wallet, the money, whatever money you have, you know, anything of value. And then they said, and took his weapon, sure, and they told him, well, okay, you're free now, you can go. And he said he thought that was, they were just setting him up to shoot him, say he tried to escape, and he said he just started. He didn't ask where to go or what. He just started walking and hoping that they wouldn't shoot him in the back, and they didn't. They wanted to get rid of him, see. And so that was that episode. I thought I would mention about that.
Now, at the Elbe, were there actually boats transporting Germans across?
Let me give you a verbal picture of that. The Elbe. Oh, incidentally, we met some other GIs where we were from some other outfit, and among them, there was a Russian soldier. He was very young. I don't know. Maybe because he was short, we thought he might be a 16 or 18 year older. By that time, you see, I was 20 years old, and or past 20 years old, and he still had his Russian helmet, Russian uniform, and all that on the banks of the Elbe. We would go walk along the Elbe bank on our side, and we would see lots of people on the other side. We couldn't tell distinctly who they were, but there were a lot of civilians there. And then all of a sudden you'd hear airplanes, and they'd come along the other bank of the Elbe and strafe them and work them up and down. And those were American airplanes. They were Russians, but we had given those planes to the Russians. And I forget if I look in one of my books, I'll know the model, whether it was called the Era Cobra or what, I'm not sure. Whether it had a number like P-38, I may be confusing that with some other American airplane, or with the Germans had a pistol called the P-38. We were told not to even go down there and look, let alone cross. But we had heard stories about guys taking a rowboat or something and crossing over and getting stuff from the Germans, getting stuff. Everybody wanted to have a Luger pistol or this and that. So one day, our lieutenant said, okay, he'll take, we're not supposed to do this. Oh, I'll have another little story about our lieutenant in that location, but that can come later. We're not to talk about this, but he's willing to go over with us in a rowboat, and we'd have to come back as soon as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So I managed to get in on it, and there must have been about 6 or 8 of us, but no more than that. And we got in this pretty deep rowboat. And I had canoed when I was even much younger on a creek in Philadelphia area, and I had rowed, and I liked rowing, and they were long, small, flat-bottom boats, and so on. But this, with that not tide, but current, that's a big river, and there's no other traffic on it at that time. And we start rowing, and I don't know, we must have looked terrible from any observation from the other side. We'd be going, say we want to go there, and it's flowing this way, and we'd be going like there, and then we're trying like hell to get back up there, and then decide, well, we're going to stop down there, so let's row this way, and we'll wind up down there, and with no sense of how we're going to row back. And I was exhausted myself, and we finally get over there, and it's a quiet place. We don't see any people around, and then, the ground goes up at a fairly steep angle from the riverbank. And the lieutenant says to me, Lieutenant Pugh was his name, he must have noticed that I was awfully tired, and he said, look, Roth, you stay here, you guard the boat. You're to guard the boat, and we'll need that boat to get back. So we'll be back shortly. I said, yeah, but I want to get some guns, some pistols from them. And he said, you'll get your share. So they took off. And they took off, and here comes some German soldier. I don't know if he's a non-commissioned officer or what. He struck me as being of that level, and especially the way he's armed. He's got big holster here. That's a P-38. It's a 38 caliber, and I'll describe you in detail someday about that gun. I said to him, Pistola, geben Sie mir die Pistola. Okay. Yeah, he takes it off. He goes to me, and he tells me, no, what he says to me is, I could walk a mile for a camel. And that was a very common expression because it was the slogan for Camel cigarettes in their ads. And I said, you'd have to walk miles and miles for a Camel now, wouldn't you? And he said, yes, that's true, but you don't, do you? I said, no, you can have some of these cigarettes. I always had cigarettes, although I didn't smoke them. I smoked pipe primarily. And I asked him, how did you learn that expression? And he said, well, in the States. So tell me about in the States. He said, I was a student in New York for a few years, or a couple of years.
You're conversing in English?
In English, yeah. Yeah, he was telling me this. And I said, well, he said, now I'd like to go back with you. And I said, well, my crew is going to be here, and my lieutenant will have to make the decision on that. I knew for sure we weren't going to take anybody back with us. We weren't supposed to be there. And so he sits down aside, and he looks to me like he's not going to be any trouble either. And then they, and I think another one showed up, but let's say the group came back. And of course, they had some Germans tagging along with them, fortunately very few. And they said they wanted to come back with us. So we said to them, no, we can't do that because we're not even supposed to be talking to you guys. But we don't want to see you suffer here. So we're going to come back when it's dark. And you wait for us here at 7. We'll be back at 7 o'clock this evening, and we'll take you back. I mean, you got to lie your way out in these situations, you know. And they had more pistols. They said, I didn't tell them about the pistol I already had under my jacket. And I got another choice pistol, a Walther PP something, whether it's PPK or what. It's supposed to be the pistol of the Secret Service, police, detectives, and so on. I gave them up a long time ago. I traded them in for that Bolex camera and more. I got a couple other pistols too. But we made our way back. I don't know how. And that was the end of that story. I always felt, it's a shame to have misled these people, but when you think about what went on in that war, they probably were aware that the odds of being picked up at 7 o'clock were going to be mighty slim. But we did see those planes coming over and strafe those people, civilians, a lot of them civilians, trying to get over to this other side. So Lieutenant Pugh was my lieutenant, and he was a very nice person. But it seemed to me he really never understood what I was talking about, what I wanted to see happen, and so on and so forth. That didn't bother me. But something came of that situation. We always posted guards. We always had to post guards wherever we were. And we knew the Germans were not going to come and attack us now at that little town there along the Elbe, but still I had to stand guard duty. So here is a street that comes into this little village, and that's the vulnerable point. You know, that's where any people coming in the German jeeps to attack us would come, and so the guard stands there and challenges everybody who comes along that road. Well, near that point, there was a nice full-grown bush, shrub, so well filled out that I could step into it and you wouldn't know I was there. And I thought that's the idea, that's the way guard should be handled, you see. And so I was always thinking how I could better design things than other people. I'm going to be an architect. So I step into the bush, you see. And then whenever somebody comes along, I had something so clever, I can't think of it now. It's something like, stop now. And not halt, you know, and because I'd wait till they were right on top of me. So what happens? Here comes Lieutenant Pugh with another officer, and they don't sense me at all. And it's not dark or anything. It's evening, but it's still daylight. And as soon as they come up parallel to me, I say, "I've got you now. Don't move," or words to that effect. Of course, it embarrassed Lieutenant Pugh very much in front of this other officer. And he said, "Who is that? Roth, what are you doing in there? You're supposed to be on guard." And I said, "Yeah, but isn't this a lot more effective?" Okay, end of the scene one. Scene two, I'm in bed. I'm on my cot. Lieutenant Pugh comes around to see me. It was either that night or the next morning, real early. And he says, "Roth, you just don't understand the Army." And I said, "That's right. I'm very sorry about that, because I'm almost out of the Army, I hope, and the Army doesn't understand me at all." I said, "How could that be?" So that was the end of the conversation. So we eventually were sent back to a town called Neuhaldensleben, some distance west from where we were, and not far from Magdeburg, which is very famous because of a physics lesson is taught around the use of two large hemispheres, steel hemispheres, that are vacuumized, and the horses couldn't pull them apart. And that took place in centuries ago in Magdeburg. Well, after spending a little while in Magdeburg, having some very Pacific adventures there, we were replaced by the British. The occupation zones were going to take effect, and the American occupation zone was farther west and farther south. And so we left, the British went into Magdeburg. Eventually, our outfit was split up. We went from the 9th Army into the 7th Army, I believe, and different guys were sent to different locations. My friend Ed Bierman, who I mentioned, he was sent to a concentration camp that had a very famous inmate called the Bitch of Belsen. That was the concentration camp. She was a German officer there. And I was sent to the 8th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, and I think it was called Butzbach near Frankfurt on the Main, and eventually wound up at the American Military University in Shrivenham, England, near Oxford, between Oxford and Swindon in England. That was a real American university. The faculty was brought over from the States. All the equipment and the books and whatever we used and that's a whole story in itself. And we were, the soldiers had to have so many points before they could be sent home and let out of the service. And that depended on how long you were in the service, where you served, I guess, and whether you had decorations. They would add points to the total. And I was just a few points under, so after that my time would be up at the university in England, I would have to go back to Germany. My outfit was split up. I don't know where I would wind up. But fortunately, while I was at the university, I was told to report to the commanding general's office. And when I did that, there were a group of other soldiers there too, and we were all being awarded medals. And mine was a Bronze Star. I didn't even know that I had been nominated for such a thing, and that gave me sufficient points to be sent home. I should have been sent home in the late fall of 45, before Christmas time, the late fall. And what happened? The USS Wasp aircraft carrier was supposed to be the ship. It was caught in a terrible record-making North Atlantic storm. Some sailors were killed. The sides were stove in. These are big roll-up doors, like garage doors, where they store the planes underneath the flight deck. They call that the hangar deck underneath. And instead, we had to wait for another aircraft carrier, a brand new one called the Lake Champlain. And that gave us almost endless 2- and 3-day passes. We could go anywhere in the UK that we could manage. I always went to London, except for one trip to Liverpool to see my old family friend there, the Ball family, whose daughter had her eyes on me, and vice versa. And I did have many good weekends, really, in London primarily, and finally got on the Lake Champlain on the evening, the exact time of my birth, on my 21st birthday at 5:10 p.m. in the evening. But instead of record-breaking 3 days to cross the Atlantic, because the Champlain had done that from Gibraltar to Newport News in about 3.5 or 4 days, setting a record, we hit stormy weather, very stormy weather going back. It took 10 days, and we only got up above the hangar deck, which is completely enclosed, one time, and then we couldn't wait to get back down because it was so windy. The sailors were playing football on the deck, but every time that ball went in the air, it went overboard. So fortunately, no sailors went overboard. So that'll bring the story to a good closing point, I hope.
All right. Yeah, we have less than a minute left, I think, so that should do it. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Ah.